I now want to invite Joffrey Black, President and General Minister of the UCC, to return to the podium to introduce this year's Parker Lecturer.
Thank you, Sarah. It's certainly an honor for me to be with you this morning as well to introduce our guest speaker. Throughout history, the United Church of Christ Office of Communication, Inc. has always sat at the intersection of telecommunications, policy, and religion. And each year, we try to reflect that junction of those worlds in a person we invite to deliver the annual Everett C. Parker Ethics in Telecommunications Lecture. This year's speaker, to our great delight, is well-grounded in both of those worlds. Stephen Waldman has served as co-founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of BeliefNet.com when he was drafted to author a major FCC report on the state of the media. In announcing Waldman's appointment, FCC Chairman Julius Jankowski said he was, quote, uniquely qualified for that job because he was, quote, an award-winning journalist in the traditional media who became an internet pioneer, launching, running, and bringing to profitability one of the great content success stories. Earlier this year, the FCC issued Waldman's report entitled Information Needs of Communities, the Changing Media Landscape in a Broadband Age. NPR's On the Media described it as one of the most comprehensive overviews of U.S. media ever produced. The study assessed important policy and regulatory issues and made recommendations for government, the private sector, and not-for-profit media. But Steve Waldman is not your typical policy wonk. In 2000, Time magazine identified him as one of its 100 spiritual innovators of the new millennium. During his tenure, BeliefNet won the General Excellence Award of the Online News Association and the National Magazine Award for General Excellence Online. His own journalism has appeared in media outlets ranging across the spectrum, from Huffington Post to National Review Online, and from the Washington Post to ChristianityToday.com. He also wrote the New York Times best-selling book, Founding Faith, Providence, Politics, and the Birth of Religious Freedom in America, a book that I would commend to all of you, and certainly for religious leadership. It is an asset in advancing the conversation in this nation around the relationship between church and state. Here to deliver the 29th Annual Everett C. Parker Ethics in Telecommunications Lecture, please join me in welcoming Steve Waldman.
Thank you so much. This really is a tremendous honor for me. Thank you, Reverend Black. It's a great honor to be here with you, Reverend Parker, and the other honorees. In particular, Commissioner Copps. I've gotten to know Commissioner Copps a little bit during my time at the FCC and came to see what many of you have known for many years before me, that few people in American life are as committed as he is and has been to ensuring that the media systems work on behalf of all Americans. I have been really looking forward to this talk because it's probably the first time, maybe the only time, that I can talk to an audience that's equally obsessed with my two great interests, religion and the news media, which by most of my friends were thought to be completely unrelated. And yet, there are a surprising number of similarities that I want to talk about. For one thing, both religion and news media have at times wondered how they could keep from being overrun by technology. In the early days of BeliefNet, I used to talk to clergy all the time who were very worried about how the internet was going to destroy or undercut organized religion? Won't people just cobble together their own hollow, easy-to-bake religion instead of going to church or going to house of worship? Won't they stop coming through our doors? And I used to point out at that time that in the early days of the internet, everyone thought that from here on, all toys are going to be bought on etoys.com. You may not know that website anymore because it went out of business, as I would point out. And I said, now actually most toys online are bought on the website of toysrus.com. Toys R Us is what in this world, the lingo was known as a bricks and mortar operation. That's not to say the bricks and mortar operations always win, but they do start with some advantages. I remember telling a group of Catholic priests, you know, most startup ventures can get venture capital funding if they prove that their business model has worked for a few months. And you guys have a business model that's worked for a few millennia. Work with that. You've got a pretty strong brand, a lot of distribution outlets, good theme songs. You have a lot going for you. And yes, you'll have to change, but if you embrace technology, use it as an exciting way to get your message out, rather than sticking your head in the sand and hoping it goes away, you will thrive. And that would turn out to have been very good advice for the newspaper industry and for TV managers as well. Embrace the technology, use it, and you may be able to use the technology to help advance your mission rather than allowing it to destroy you. Another similarity between religion and journalism, both care in some sense about the good news. When religious folks, of course, talk about the good news, they mean Christ's message of redemption. When journalists talk about good news, they mean maybe news that's well done, that informs, educates, holds public officials accountable. It seems different, but there are more similarities, I think, than might be first apparent. And I don't mean only that both newspapers and the Holy Scriptures tell stories about murders, floods, health tips, and religious wars. Rather, they both attempt to get at something they call the truth. They do so, of course, in profoundly different ways. The world's great religious faiths try to explain big truths, why we're here on this earth, how we are fundamentally connected to each other. Journalism attempts to describe what has happened and why. And they view evidence differently, use evidence differently. But they both attempt to get at the question, why is the world this way? Now, I don't mean to romanticize either profession. Obviously, both religion and journalism practitioners have too often been corrupted. Some religious and journalistic leaders, practitioners, have abused their roles by being spiritually or intellectually dishonest, or abusing their tremendous power to pit human beings against each other and to spread misunderstanding and ignorance. In both professions, the corrupt ones have abused a sacred public trust. But the best among journalistic and religious practitioners take their callings very seriously. And now I'm going to make a confession. So I hope the folks in New York are listening carefully and with some generosity. In the course of my 10 years leading BeliefNet, I was interviewed hundreds of times on TV and radio and elsewhere, and thankfully I was never asked the one question I dreaded, which was, do you believe in God? And if so, why? And I dreaded this question not because I didn't believe in God, I do, but because my personal path to belief was so weirdly idiosyncratic that I thought it would puzzle or alienate many of our readers. So I was happy for it to not come up, because it wouldn't be about any particularly classic divine experience. He never spoke to me in a burning shrubbery in Prospect Park. I believed because of what would sometimes happen when I sat down to write. Oftentimes there's a point in the writing process, in the journalistic process, when the shortcuts beckon. If I phrase the sentence this way, it might be a little bit less accurate, but much more interesting. And who would know? If I turn the characters in this drama into caricatures, sure, it would lose some nuance, but it would be much more readable. And who would know? And then it occurred to me, I actually came to believe in there being a truth in the matter. I believed that if I didn't make an intellectually honest attempt to capture what actually happened, he would know. Somewhat to my surprise, I realized I believed that there was such a thing as truth, and in the need to reveal it. I confess this with some trepidation because my confession will strike most journalists as unjournalistic, unempirical, and unbecoming. A journalist friend of mine a number of years ago said, you know, journalism is not one of the healing professions. And in some sense, he's right. To be a good journalist, you must be unsentimental and relentless and sometimes harsh. Usually, you really cannot get caught up in wondering what might hurt someone's feelings. But I disagree in another sense. The best journalists that I have known and worked with actually have a very strong moral and spiritual core. When confronted with the extreme difficulty of unraveling what happened, the best journalists do not merely throw up their hands and declare, it's hard to say, so I won't try. I'll rely on lazy he said, she said reporting. I'll be a stenographer instead of a reporter. I'll rely on press releases and spin instead of hard work of digging. Now, the good ones instead proclaim, it's hard to say, so I'll try harder. When in the privacy of their cubicle, they realize they could subtly present information in a different way, even to make the bad guy look a little worse, which is very tempting sometimes. A still small voice tells them to stop, not because they'll get caught, but because a more theological idea has snuck into their cynical brains, that there is such a thing as truth, and it is my professional obligation to seek it. That is why the best journalists that I have known in my life often have been among the most morally grounded people I have known. And I have to say, when the FCC chairman asked me to look at the state of the American news media, he did not suggest that I do this to explore whether God was pleased with the state of the news media, although that might have meant we'd get less Republican criticism if he had. Rather, his mission was more Madisonian, to find out whether the modern media system was working for democracy. He asked me almost 2 years ago to assess the changing media landscape and report on whether communities were getting the information and the news that they needed and deserved. So we did a 360-something page report, which you can find at fcc.gov/info-needs report. But my tweet-length summary is this. There is tremendous innovation in the modern media landscape, but there are also some very worrisome consequential gaps. Let's start with the bad news. Staffing in America's newspaper newsrooms has dropped by more than 25% in the last few years, with many newspapers losing as much as half of their staffs, some newspapers shutting down entirely. Newspaper staffing now is at the same level, about the same level, maybe a little less, as it was before Watergate. You can see this rippling through cities and in different beats. In Baltimore, they did a study showing that the newspapers there produced 32% fewer stories in 2009 than in 1999. Another study looked at Philadelphia as a case study and concluded in just a 3-year period from 2006 to 2009, available news about public affairs issues has dramatically diminished by many measures, news hole, airtime, keyword measurements. A study of the Raleigh-Durham market, as an example, said that the News Observer there, a formerly Fine newspaper, in 2004 had 250 newsroom employees. By February of this year, it was down to 103. Now, the really significant thing there is to look at the beats that were eliminated. Courts, schools, legal affairs. agriculture, environment, state education. These cuts have rippled through in very frightening ways. State House coverage. From 2003 to 2008, while state spending on grew by about 20%, the numbers of reporters covering the state legislatures dropped by 1/3. That's a pretty disturbing formula for anyone who's interested in safeguarding public dollars. Investigative news, and this is a little bit of a squishy term to define, so we looked for indirect clues, but here are a few. The Investigative Reporters and Editors Association, the membership of IRE in 2003 was 5,400 people. Now it is 4,000 people. Submissions to the Pulitzer Prize Public Service category dropped 43% from 1984 to 2010. Coverage of Washington. 27 states have no Washington reporters. The numbers of papers with bureaus in D.C. are down by about a half since the mid-1980s. And then there's my old beat, religion. I asked Deborah Mason, the head of the Religion News Writers Association, how things were going since I left. She said simply, oh, religion news at the local level is nearly gone. Now, it's not always the case that beats are entirely eliminated. In many cases, what's happened is that the beats remain, but the reporters doing them are stretched thinner, where once they covered 2 counties, now they're covering 4, or once they did 1 story a day, now they do a print version and a blog post and a bunch of tweets. The Columbia Journalism Review described this as life on the hamster wheel. This being a government report, I tried to bureaucratize the language a little bit, and we referred to this as the hamsterization trend. And as cute as the image is, the consequences are really very serious. For instance, the Kaiser Family Foundation did a study of health coverage, concluded that interest in health coverage is up. The number of health reporters is down, which has led, in their view, to, quote, a loss of in-depth enterprise and policy-related stories. Same thing in education. Reporters are overextended. Richard Colvin, formerly of the Hechinger Institute, said, quote, local coverage has not likely dropped in volume, but it has certainly dropped in ambition. Those who cover education may not do so full-time and don't have the leeway to write much of substance. So to use the metaphor of the media landscape, which we do a lot in this report, we actually have many ways of looking out at the landscape and describing what we see, but we have less time to turn over the rocks and look in the shadows. One of the most surprising findings for us is that despite the empowering nature of digital tools, and we have seen digital tools help to bring down governments, we have also seen a countervailing shift, a shift of power away from citizens towards institutions. The Pew study of Baltimore wrote, as news is posted faster, often with little enterprise reporting added, the official version of events is becoming more important. We found official press releases often appear word for word in first accounts of events, though not often noted as such. Government, at least in this study, initiates most of the news. One PR professional explained, quote, newsrooms have been gutted, and particularly at the local level, journalists rely on press releases to help them fill the ever-increasing news hole. They were actually viewed this as a positive, not as a negative. But I think the rest of us might be worried about it. Now, one of the writing challenges of this report is how do you illustrate the impact of stories not written? It's proving a negative. So we looked for indirect hints of this. So Bell, California, I'm sure you're familiar with this case, the chief administrative officer getting paid $787,000. The LA Times broke the story, actually won a Pulitzer Prize for it in June of 2010. But the excessive payments began at least as far back as 2005. So the loss of taxpayers was at least $5.6 million from the fact that there was no one covering the Bell City Council. Several publications reported brilliantly on the Upper Big Branch mine disaster in West Virginia. They reported that they had 1,342 serious safety violations in 5 years. But we are left to wonder whether the 29 people who died in that disaster might still have been alive if newspapers or TV stations had done the same reporting before the accident that they did after the accident. I was probably most touched by the people in communities trying to solve local problems, not by the journalists, but the civic leaders, citizens, who need the information to in order to do their important work. In Michigan, for instance, the coverage of juvenile courts has gotten smaller and smaller over the years, according to Vivek Sankaran of the University of Michigan, an expert on family courts. I asked him, well, you know, what does that matter? What are the results of that? He said, quote, parents whose rights are terminated, who shouldn't be terminated. It just takes somebody to go down there to get the story, he said, but nobody is ever down there. I've mostly focused on newspapers, but what about the rest of the traditional media? We looked a lot at local TV. In one sense, you know, over the last 7 years, the number of hours of local TV news has actually gone up. It's risen by 35%. And the best stations really are doing more and better than ever before because they're combining the traditional media techniques with really fantastic user-generated content and involving the community. But on average, local TV increased the hours of coverage while reducing their staff. Bleeding is still leading. 1 out of 3 LA broadcasts led their news stories with a newscast with a crime story, according to Annenberg. Another study said that 1/4 of the crime stories in the LA market were from out of town, which is really an amazing thing to think about. So even if there didn't happen to be a murder that day, they imported it from another city. The beat system is disintegrating. There's less depth. The study of LA by Annenberg said that education, healthcare, and government took up over about a little over 1 minute of a 30-minute broadcast. Other key trends. TV network news staff down by half since the late 1980s. News magazine reporters staff down by almost half since the 1980s. Radio, local, national news and talk actually is growing. Local news is not. In fact, it's shrinking. The number of all-news local radio stations has dropped from 50 in the 1980s to about 30 today. So currently about 1/3 of the population has the benefit of an all-news radio station. Local cable news. Once it looked like this really might be a very significant addition to the media landscape, local cable news, but it appears to have plateaued at around 25 to 30% of the population now has access to local cable news. Now, this only represents a part of the story. Obviously, if the gaps in traditional media were being filled by the new media, we would have nothing to worry about. So we looked at that question next. What is going on the new media side? A year or so ago, you would have had traditional media folks really disparaging the internet media as just about opinion mongering, the famous pajama-clad bloggers. And that's just wrong. You know, it should be clear at this point that digital technology has, in fact, improved journalism in many ways. Lower barriers to entry and vast amount of space online have led actually to a greater diversity of voices, increased depth for some types of coverage, and more consumer choices. Technology has reduced the cost of gathering, producing, and distributing news, which allows for, among other things, new players who had been shut out of traditional media to get in it. Reporters can use computerized databases to pull together stories in hours that would have taken weeks. Search engine-driven internet has just made it much easier to find stuff out. We can get news on demand when we need it, when we're ready to consume it in real time through desktop, tablet, phone, TV, video, text, or an infinite combination. In many ways, citizens are more empowered. They can choose where to get their content, what content to get, how to share it, and they are helping to report it themselves. And when the image to me that sort of conveys how dramatically things have changed is compare some of one of the most abiding images from the Vietnam War. It was the horrific photo of the screaming girl running away from napalm taken by a courageous Vietnamese war correspondent. The most indelible image recently an Iranian woman being shot during protest, Neda Agha Sultan, was taken by a doctor on his cell phone. Had an equally powerful impact. Now, most of the websites that get most attention are National, Huffington Post, Politico, Daily Caller, but just as exciting are the hundreds of impressively creative websites on the local level. MinPost, Voice of San Diego, Texas Tribune, Bay Citizen, Sacramento Press, California Watch, many other local operations. And one of the most exciting areas really is hyperlocal coverage, news on a block-by-block level. Because really, even in newspapers' fattest, happiest days, there was a limit to how granular they could get. And now you have citizens being able to help cover their blocks and their neighborhoods in a way that couldn't before. Now, a lot of these aren't profitable businesses necessarily, but they don't necessarily have to be. These are civic institutions, sort of 1,000 points of journalism. And they're playing really very important role. But one of the most important things we learned in this report is that an abundance of media outlets does not necessarily mean abundance of media reporting. For instance, Pew, again, studied that Baltimore media system, and they found 53 different outlets. That's a lot. It would seem like this city was suffering no shortage of journalism, but when they analyzed all the stories on city affairs, turned out 95% of the stories, including those in the new media, were based on the reporting done by the traditional media, mostly the Baltimore Sun and one of the TV stations, and those sources were doing less than they'd done in the past. Several other studies have found the same thing. Researchers at the Neiman Labs looked at 121 distinct stories on Google News about a particular story relating to Google being hacked. They found that only 13 of the 121 contained, quote, some amount of original reporting. Only one of those was produced by an online outlet. The other 100-plus stories were essentially rewrites, summaries, or links done to the small number of outlets. In 2009, Michigan State University did a massive study. They looked at 6,800 stories in 486 news outlets, 98 cities, 77 suburbs. They concluded that 88% of the news about city governments and 93% of the news about suburban governments came from traditional media, even today. Quote, this finding should give significant pause to those who believe that the new media will fill any gaps left by the old media. In other words, the proliferation of the outlets is not the same thing as an increase in reporting, and in some cases can actually camouflage a drop in reporting. It's not to say it's not valuable. It's incredibly valuable, but we should be really clear about what the benefits are and what the gaps are that still remain. Now, what about these innovative websites that I've talked about? Really, in some ways, they're very encouraging, but I guess I would say as of this moment, they have the skill but not the scale. That was brought home when I was at a conference during this process run by the Knight Foundation, which funds a lot of these organizations. And it was a very inspiring group. I mean, really, some of these are laid-off newspaper reporters who went to create these, or just concerned citizens who worried about what was going on in their community. I tallied up how many full-time reporters together they all employed, and it was 88. That's not impressive until you remind yourself that newspapers have lost 15,000 reporters in the last decade. Poynter Institute tried to put a dollar amount on this. They said that spending on editorial and newspapers, just newspapers, has dropped by $1.6 billion annually. On the other hand, a study of foundation money going into local journalism concluded that about $180 million had been put in over 5 years to help fill these gaps. So $1.6 billion out, $180 million in. The FCC report offers a number of suggestions for how to fill these gaps. While we did declare that government is not the main player in this drama, we did nonetheless suggest a number of significant policy suggestions for government as well as other players in the system, and I want to just talk about a couple of them. For instance, government at all levels should dramatically increase the information that it puts online. Health data, criminal justice data, political campaign contributions, government spending. You talked before about these are the public's airwaves. We have a right to expect something of it. This is the public's data, too, and we have a right to see it for free. Or how about this? Here was another idea that we talked about. The federal government currently spends between $500 million and $1 billion a year on advertising. Almost all of this goes to national broadcast and cable operators. How about if we ask them, federal government, to consider putting this advertising money through local media, local newspapers, TV stations, nonprofits, websites. This could be more cost-effective in reaching their messaging. It could create some jobs locally. And it will help struggling innovative local media to get traction with their business models and serve their communities. The government, we argued, on behalf of taxpayers, can and should ask something more of the broadcasters that use the public airwaves. It is totally appropriate, for instance, to ask them to disclose not only how much coverage they do about their community, but what kinds of coverage and other things, news sharing arrangements, things like that. And I don't mean coverage that is locally relevant, because that is a loophole that you can drive a truck through. I mean coverage about the community in the common sense way that that term can be understood. I also think that stations should be required to disclose online pay-for-play situations. Pay-for-play, this is one of the most disturbing things we found about in the local TV market. Not all TV stations, I don't think this is by any way a majority, but there are a disturbing number of stations that essentially are allowing advertisers to dictate the content of some of the content on their news shows. Sure, we'll take a sponsorship from this hospital. All we have to do is agree to only interview people from that hospital, or to agree to take the health stories from their list. This is appalling and is going to really undercut trust in local TV news if it spreads. Now, they are all actually already required to disclose this through sponsorship identification rules. But it's a fleeting mention at the end of the broadcast. So I thought a simple change, say if you are required to disclose this at the end of your broadcast, you should now be required to put it online permanently, forever, in an easily searchable format so that citizens can compile this, come up with a list of the stations in America that have the most pay-for-play violations. The national religious broadcasters had an interesting suggestion to us, which we embraced, which was that for religious broadcasters, when they're producing shows that are about local problems or international problems, shouldn't they be allowed to help raise money for the charity that's working on that? They said, why don't you at least start as an experiment by having 1% of our airtime be allowed to do fundraising. You allow us to do this occasionally for disasters. And I thought, well, it is pretty hard for the FCC to justify saying, we will do this for disasters that involve wind or rain, but we will not do this for disasters of slowly creeping famine or local hunger. So I like this idea of allowing for that kind of flexibility. Most important, government has to make sure that this country has universal access to high-speed internet. It's a matter of economics and equity. Economics, because these business models that I talked about before are going to have an easier time getting traction if there are more people visiting them. If you get the rest of the country online working in high-speed internet, that would lead to a 50% increase in potential customers. Equity, of course, because if traditional media is contracting and yet there are simultaneously all these wonderful things going on online, but you're not online, you've actually taken a step backwards in terms of the information you as a citizen can have. You know, we would never have thought of building the interstate highway system, but saying the poor were not allowed to use this highway system, or we weren't going to put exits there. We made sure that the Postal Service would reach everyone at some expense. And as the internet transforms media, bringing benefits, tremendous benefits, to those who can use it, we need to make sure that everyone can reap those benefits. But ultimately, these problems will only be solved if the public, citizens, foundations, philanthropists, civic leaders come to believe that having a healthy media system actually matters And I became a little worried as I did this that basic thing, which I know everyone in this room believes, is not a commonly held view. It is not clear or commonly believed by many Americans that this matters. If we don't have good journalism, especially strong, tough accountability journalism, democracy cannot function. If politicians, businesses, civic leaders, religious leaders, all powerful institutions are not watched carefully, they will grow corrupt. I think that is something that religious leaders have taught us and got right pretty much, that there is enough inherent in enough people that unfortunate corrupt nature that will be the tendency if they are not watched. And by the way, as you know, when this kind of corruption happens, it does not tend to be the most powerful people in a community that suffer. They usually figure out ways to survive dysfunctional political systems. It is local public health that will suffer. It is schools that will suffer, become less effective at teaching and less able to provide opportunity to all Americans. Lives will be lost. The least powerful will remain voiceless. The fabric of communities will fray. And I fear too often the moral conscience of communities will not be sufficiently aroused, not because citizens stopped caring, but because they stopped knowing. Now, on the other hand, I want to remind you that our report also concluded that the new technologies have, in many ways, improved accountability, improved access to information, and empowered citizens to both contribute and share their news. That really is true. We have had tremendous advances. At the same time, we have these deficits, which leads me to today's good news. If we can work together to preserve the tremendous benefits of the new technology and make sure that they are available to all, while at the same time addressing the serious challenges, we will in fact have the best media system we have ever had. So that is the challenge, I think, for all of us, is to work toward that goal, which I think is achievable, but only if we come together and realize that what is happening currently in modern media matters a lot. Thank you very much.
Move over here. We should know it by now.
I'm getting, could you, I'm getting.
Oh, so is this better? Thanks very much. Thank you for yours. Thank you very much, Steve, for those provocative remarks, and I anticipate that the FCC.gov website is going to see a spike of hits from this audience wanting to delve more deeply into your report. And thank you to our friends in New York with the National Council of Churches and Odyssey Networks for making time to join us. And since I hope by now Pat Patillo has actually been able to sit down for a few minutes and relax from running his own meeting, I want to thank him again for his support and hard work and wish him a happy and productive retirement. Over the past months, our airways have been full of stories recounting the events of 9/11 and how all of us have changed over the 10 years since the attacks. It is easy for those of us in the public interest community to focus on the ways in which we feel the media fail us. So before I introduce the person who will deliver our closing prayer, I wanted to share a little good news story with you. 2 weeks ago, my United Church of Christ congregation in suburban Virginia invited members of the closest mosque to join us for worship on Sunday, September 11th. The local ABC affiliate, WJLA-TV, sent out a camera crew and devoted 2.5 minutes of its early evening news show to a report on our service. It captured the spiritual essence of our worship together and included thoughtful interviews with persons who had attended the service, and I think it may still be on their website. One of the leaders of that service was Imam Jahari Abdul Malik, who serves as Director of Outreach of the Dar al-Hijra Islamic Center in Falls Church, Virginia. Imam Johari also serves as president of the Muslim Society of Washington and head of the National Association of Muslim Chaplains in Higher Education. We'd like to call on him now to lead us in our closing prayer.
Let us open our hearts and our minds. O transcendent and fully eminent force in our lives, we know that you have taught us through your many guides and messengers that words have power, and that everything that is in creation was brought into existence by your word. The Quran uses the phrase kun fayakun, that everything came into existence because you said be, and it is. We call on that force in our lives to bless us with a conviction to have and use the power of words. Grant us the supremacy of great ideals. Let us be inspired by the inevitable results of persistent and consistent efforts of goodness, of love and of humility. Help us as we leave this place to continue to overcome the temptation of expediency, and cause us to work and live together in the pursuit of that fleeting element we call the truth. We pray that you might inspire us to continue to live and to celebrate our freedom of speech, our freedom of assembly, and our freedom of worship. That we as a people might work together, live together, play together, learn together, and struggle together. That we might, through the power of our words, bring a healing to this world. May we all affirm in our own ways. Amen.
Thank you, Imam Johari. As we depart, we want to wish our Jewish friends a happy and meaningful New Year as they celebrate Rosh Hashanah tonight. For those of you who have recently transitioned into retirement or new roles or about to do so, we wish you happiness in your new endeavors. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. Whatever challenges you face today or tomorrow, we hope that you will be inspired once again by our time together this morning. Thank you.